And that's the opportunity, is there are a lot of tools in Web 2.0 technologies that are available to support this kind of activity within the enterprise. The problem is they are individual tools, and bringing them together in an effective assembly so that they can really support exception handling is still quite challenging in most enterprises, and it's why these technologies haven't been widely adopted in this area. And it creates an opportunity to define open frameworks that facilitate the incorporation of these tools into a seamless environment that can be used to support exception handling. The business case for this kind of application of this technology is quite compelling, given near-term cost savings. As I indicated, the exception handling activity is terribly inefficient without the benefit of technology support. So you get much more efficient tacit collaboration, opportunity for near-term cost savings from that efficiency. But there's an added benefit into the business case, which is that it represents a longer-term innovation platform. Because for the first time now, you take these exceptions that are emerging across the enterprise and making them visible. You're creating records of what exceptions emerged, with what frequency. Were they truly one-off exceptions, or were they in fact exceptions that are starting to emerge with increasing frequency? If you look at exceptions, they can be understood as an early warning sign or an early signal of potential innovation opportunities. They represent unmet needs that existing processes, standardized processes cannot handle. And if you look at the patterns and see that exceptions are emerging with increasing frequency, you now have an opportunity to start to focus innovation and say there's a way to rethink our processes to more effectively handle these kinds of unmet needs. So I think exception handling represents a significant economic opportunity for this set of technologies to address. But it also suggests there's a second opportunity related to exception handling. If you look at where exceptions emerge within the enterprise, typically they emerge most frequently at the edge of the enterprise, where you're dealing with customers, distribution channels, business partners of various types. And the emergence of much more sophisticated collaborative process networks on a global scale are creating another application opportunity for Web 2.0 technologies. To illustrate the opportunity here, I tend to go to my favorite example of a global process network, which is run by a Chinese company known as Lianfeng. Lianfeng serves apparel designers and basically puts together customized supply chains for an apparel designer. Basically, as an illustration, you can take a high-end wool sweater. Lianfeng may work on sourcing the yarn for that sweater in Korea, have the yarn dyed in Thailand, woven in Taiwan, perhaps cut in Bangladesh, and then assembled, if it's for a U.S. retailer, in Mexico, and then delivered to the retail distribution centers that are appropriate. And there are very complicated logistics that accompany the movement of this product across all these different activities and national boundaries. Now, Lianfeng actually does none of this work itself. It relies on a very large network of 10,000 business partners in 48 different countries around the world. So what they have in effect done is create a very large network of specialized providers that come together and collaborate around the development of these customized supply chains. High degree of flexibility and responsiveness to unanticipated market conditions. And it illustrates a much broader trend in outsourcing as we move from peripheral and generic activities like human resource administration to outsourcing of core business processes like supply chain management and manufacturing activities. There's a tendency to expand the relationships from just one outsourcing provider to a very large number of specialized providers that come together. And coordinating this activity requires a lot of collaboration across individuals in many different enterprises. And again, Web 2.0 technologies, with their emphasis on distributed, collaborative, and cumulative creation, can provide significant platforms for this kind of coordination activity. If you step back from these two related opportunities, exception handling and global process networks, I actually see an opportunity for Web 2.0 technologies to be catalyst for even broader opportunity, which is a rethinking of IT architectures at a fundamental level. If you look at the evolution of IT architectures over time, again, a very broad generalization, we've followed a trajectory from inside to outside. So initially, IT architectures were very much focused on the centralized glass house, eventually moved out to departments, ultimately moved out to work groups and desktops, and very haltingly and somewhat inefficiently tried to connect activities across multiple enterprises. I think there's an opportunity now as we move to much more sophisticated process networks that embrace hundreds, if not thousands, of business partners to rethink IT architectures at a fundamental level and go from, instead of from inside out, start with a clean sheet and say, what would an IT architecture look like if it started with the notion of moving from the outside in, connecting thousands of business enterprises together? The architectures actually would be quite different on many levels. So in terms of control points, the benefit of an inside-out architecture is you can assume there's one control point, one CIO ultimately who can dictate standards and technology deployment. From the outside in, you deal with a much more challenging environment with autonomous entities where there is no single control point, unless of course you have an 800-pound gorilla that can enforce on its business partners certain technologies or standards. In terms of resources, we're all familiar within any enterprise there's a very heterogeneous set of IT resources that need to be connected together. And yet when you go with an outside-in architecture with thousands of enterprises needing to collaborate together, that heterogeneity is squared in a significant and much more challenging way. In terms of how you think about transactions, if you're within the enterprise, you can focus on fine-grained, short-lived transactions and design your architectures around that. If you're going from the outside in, you need to start to think about much more coarse-grained transactions that are long-lived. And as a result of that shift, the outlook in terms of transaction completion shifts from an optimistic outlook, you assume that the transactions will be successfully completed, to a more pessimistic outlook, where you need to think about compensation mechanisms that can be deployed if the transactions do not complete, because they're so long-lived and there are so many participants that are involved. This gives rise to a related architectural shift, which is thinking about the shift from transaction-based architectures to relational architectures, where the focus of IT is on supporting enduring and deepening relationships of individuals and institutions.